In the river were large islands with ponds covered with cranes, swans, ducks, and geese, so numerous that their clamor through the night kept the tired voyagers awake. They met Indians in log canoes that were some 50 feet long and carried as many as 30 persons. These Indians wore the hats and jackets of European sailors and carried muskets and pistols, which they said they got from the white sailors on the trading vessels that visited the Columbia. White fog and cold rain came in from the Pacific with a chill and bleak welcome. One morning, as the sea fog lifted, the voyagers glimpsed a vast expanse of water that they thought could only be the ocean. That ocean, the object of all our labors, the reward of all our anxieties. Faintly they could hear a muffled roar, the sound of distant breakers. The corpse had come to the end of its long quest. This cheering view exhilarated the spirits of all the party, who were still more delighted on hearing the distant roar of the breakers. The party pushed on and camped on a narrow beach under the high hills in the drenching rain. A high wind rose out of the south, driving great breakers up the narrow shore. These waves hurled tree trunks 6 feet thick onto the shore as the men fought desperately to save the canoes from being smashed. From the cliffs above, rocks loosened by the rain came crashing down around the camp. Reloading the canoes, they tried to push on, but the wild sea was so dangerous that they were again forced to land. For 6 days they were pinned on a narrow beach by the raging storm that pounded the shore with enormous waves. The party lived miserably on dried fish and rainwater. Clark had clambered up the steep slopes behind the camp only to find the forest wilderness barren of game. Shannon and Willard were sent along the shore to explore the coast. When at last the wind fell, they loaded the canoes and, rounding a rocky point, came out on a fine stretch of beach. They were just in time to rescue Shannon and Willard. The two men had met some 20 Indians who had stolen their guns. When Lewis arrived, an Indian was loading one of the stolen guns with evident intention of shooting the unarmed white men. The weather-beaten party finally made camp above the tide water where they could see, through the clearing rain and mists, the waters of the Pacific to the vast line of its far horizon. They wondered at the passing Indians who managed their canoes so skillfully in the heavy seas. The expedition had come to the ocean frontier, the final border of the Western world. This was their mission accomplished. Now they must make new plans and important decisions. Behind them were the forest-clad mountains of Oregon. In the dripping twilight under the trees, the hunters sought the vanishing elk. Above them toward the mighty trunks of trees, 200 feet high and 12 feet through. The men sat around the campfire in the cold rain discussing future plans. Winter snows had blocked the mountain passes behind them. It was too late in the season to start back. They must find winter shelter in some location where there was game for food. The Indians told them that along the south shores of the bay there were herds of deer and elk. They decided to cross over and build another winter fort. The expedition fought its way down the coast in the teeth of wind and rain and heavy seas. The roar of the pounding surf sounded continuously in their ears. Every day the hunters ranged back into the hills for elk. The men were sick of pounded fish and roots and yearned to sink their teeth once more into juicy red meat. For a few hours the sun broke through the clouds and John Shields brought in the first elk killed west of the Rockies. That night men feasted on elk tongue and marrow bones. The party camped on a narrow strip of sand and sat around the smoky fires waiting in the rain while Captain Lewis explored for a campsite. Lewis came back with good news. His party had bagged 5 deer and 6 elk and found a site for the winter fort on the bank of a river across the bay. Slowly the canoes made their way against the wind and waves around Meriwether's Bay, which Clark had named after Lewis, and up the quiet river. The fort was laid out on a little knoll by a grove of giant pine trees. Fort Clatsop, December 24th, 1805. The woodcutters and the carpenters, under Sergeant Gass's direction, attacked the tall trees with axes and saws. It rained all day and every day. They worked in the rain, they ate in the rain, they slept in the rain. It came down in torrents, in sheets, in bucketfuls. It lashed in the wind, it drizzled in the heavy sea fog. It trickled down their half-naked bodies and legs and swooshed in their rotten moccasins. In 3 weeks, the log fort stood foursquare. Its 7 snug cabins faced one another across the fort yard. The outside walls of the cabins formed the stockade of the fort. The beautiful Oregon pines split into wide, clean boards for puncheon floors and ceilings. Each room had a stone fireplace and chimney. The fort was named Fort Clatsop after the friendly Indians who were their neighbors. Their chief Kamawul is by far the most friendly and decent savage we have seen in this neighborhood, wrote Captain Lewis. The white men picked up enough of the Clatsop language to talk with the Indians. The Clatsops were very talkative, inquisitive, and intelligent. Although they were addicted to petty thieving and much gambling and had armies of fleas, they had no appetite for the white man's whiskey. They had flat heads and poor figures, but they held no resentments and kept the peace all winter. Lewis filled his journals with information about the Columbia tribes. In spite of the rain and the fleas, December 25th was still Christmas. The celebration started at daybreak. The corps fired off every gun at once in front of the startled captains' cabins and then serenaded them with a Christmas carol. Then came the presents. The captains gave each other woolen socks and shirts and presented the men with 6 carats of tobacco. Each of the men presented the captains with a remembrance. Sacagawea had been secretly preparing a surprise. She produced from nowhere 2 beautiful furs of ermine tails, one for each captain. The dinner was terrible: spoiled elk meat, fish, and roots. But the spirit of Christmas shone brightly under the dark pine trees in little Fort Clatsop, 4,000 miles beyond the Mississippi frontier. Salt and Whale, Fort Clatsop, January 8, 1805. "Can you remember what salt tasted like?" said Shannon, chewing on a slab of leathery elk meat. "Seems like I do have a faint recollection," replied Coulter, grimly swallowing a mouthful of pounded fish. "I reckon a pinch of it would taste mighty good right now," he added. A few days later, 5 men left the fort, heading for the coast. Each carried with his outfit a large iron kettle. They were going to set up a kitchen to boil salt from the seawater. A week later, 2 of them returned to the fort with a gallon of the precious salt, white, fine, and very good. Keeping the kettles boiling day and night, they could produce as much as a gallon of salt a day. They also brought a strange kind of food the Indians had given them. It looked like fat pork and tasted remarkably like beaver. It was whale meat. The Killamucks had found the stranded carcass of a whale washed up on the beach. It was decided to send an expedition to procure some of this novel food. Sacagawea came to Clark with her black eyes flashing with excitement. The poor woman stated very earnestly that she had traveled a great way with us to see the great water, yet she had never been down to the coast, and now that the monstrous fish was also to be seen, it seemed hard that she should not be permitted to see neither the ocean nor the whale. So reasonable a request could not be denied. So wrote the good-natured Clark. Next morning, the expedition paddled down the winding creeks, across the salt marshes, and reached the long Pacific beaches where the salt boilers watched their fires. Here they found a young Indian who could guide them along the coast to the whale. Where there was no beach to follow, they must detour over a high promontory so steep that they had to pull themselves up 1,000 feet of mountainside by clinging to the bushes. Seaward, the fog hung like a thick white rug. As the fog lifted, Clark could see the long Pacific breakers fringing the white beach. Far below them, they could faintly hear the seals barking where the surf broke on the black rocks. Sacagawea believed that the seal people were Indians who lived under the ocean. Over the void, a white gull wheeled with a shrill wail. Clark stood in silence. So this was it, the last frontier. His mind went back over the long trail to the tall chief in the president's house and, saluting, said, "Mission accomplished, sir. Your dream is an accomplished fact. The pathway of American destiny now lies open to the Pacific." The fog lifted, and they saw the gray sea stretching out to a long straight line of the horizon. Far up the beach they could see black specks that indicated the Killamuck village where the whale lay. "Go slow and careful," said the captain. "The ground is wet and slippery." Along the face of the barren hills, the rains had washed hundreds of acres of clayey soil into the sea. The party followed along the edge of overhanging precipices that plunged into the sea and down the steep descent until they reached the beach below. Walking along the sand for 2 miles, they came upon the carcass of the great sea beast where it lay in the wash of the breakers. The Indians had stripped off the flesh so completely that only the huge skeleton was left. Captain Clark, always seeking for facts, measured its exact length, 105 feet. Sacagawea walked up and down its vast length silently. On her back, Baptiste snored softly. The nearby Killamuck village was overflowing with whale blubber, which the Indians were boiling down by means of heated rocks. Clark, by some hard bargaining, purchased 300 pounds of the greasy food. Clambering back up the mountain, they overtook a procession of Indian squaws, bending under 100-pound packs of whale blubber. One of them, trailing along the top of a cliff, slipped her pack, but she caught it and hung onto a bush with the other arm. Clark caught her as she hung over the edge and pulled her back to safety. The party returned to the saltmakers' camp where they had left their canoes. They paddled upstream on the incoming tide to Fort Clatsop, where hungry men waited for a feast of whale blubber. Occasionally, the Indians brought dried sturgeon and wappatoo roots to the fort. Once in a great while, an Indian appeared with the beautiful gleaming skin of a sea otter, the choicest of all furs of the Pacific coast. The captains had just gone through the pompous ritual of bestowing medals on 2 Chinook chiefs who bore the exalted names of Comcomly and Chillalwil. Suddenly, among the admiring crowds, their eyes caught the shimmer of sea otter. One of the Indians had a robe made of 2 sea otter skins, the fur of which was the most beautiful we had ever seen. The owner resisted every temptation to part with it, but at length could not resist the offer of a belt of blue beads which Charbonneau's wife wore around her waist. She unclasped her precious belt of blue beads and held it out to Clark without a word. Goodbye to Fort Clatsop, March 23, 1806. Through the short winter days, the men in Fort Clatsop made candles, jerked elk meat, dressed deerskins, made them into shirts, and fashioned several hundred moccasins. Each day the hunting party went for elk and deer. Day and night the sentinels paced the barracks quadrangle, and everyone who passed the gates was reported to the captains. At sundown all Indians were put out of the fort and the gates locked until sunrise. The captains smoked and talked with the visiting Indians. Clark drew maps, and Lewis wrote a long general description of the beasts, birds, and plants, etc., found by the party in this expedition. He described at length the habits and appearance of the Indian tribes and wrote, "A Chinook or Clatsop beauty in full attire is one of the most disgusting objects in nature." As the elk and deer moved back into the hills and rations at the fort became leaner, even though the Indians now brought in sturgeon and anchovies, all that was left of their trading goods could be put in 2 handkerchiefs. The party would have to depend on their guns for food on the homeward trip. A paper was posted in the fort and distributed to the Indians, giving the names of the members of the expedition, its route, and the dates of their arrival and departure. The fort and all its furniture were presented to Chief Kamawole in acknowledgment of his friendliness. The canoes were caulked with mud. The hunters were sent ahead. The canoes were launched with every man in his place. And on March 23, 1806, in wind and rain, they bade farewell to Fort Clatsop.